I'm in a bit of a pickle because René asked me to do the opening session. So we lay the groundwork and mutually understand what the topic of the next 2 days is, what creativity is, what exactly we mean when we talk about this. But the issue is that you kind of all know. So I thought it would be kind of boring if I give you an introductory talk for like 60 minutes of stuff where you say, well, I could have also gave that talk. So my idea is I developed a couple of very analog slides and we will fill them in, and I have a couple of things I always find interesting to conceptualize creativity, and then we'll jointly for the next like 70 minutes, something like that, build the stuff that we want to work on for the next 2 days, because we're all here kind of for the same reason. So we think it's important that we talk about how we teach creativity, which means there must be some reason why we think it's important that our students learn about that. So that's the first one I would like to cover with you. And the second one I would like to do is creativity is kind of everything. So what actually do we mean in this room when we talk about creativity? And then I have I think 6 different questions that we can go through. I have a couple of slides drawn out with things I think are important for that, and then we'll jointly discuss. And if you feel that you're way better in explaining that than I am, then it's you're free to stand up, come here and say, I would explain it this way. I don't think anyone understands it the way you frame it. Maybe as a little bit of a recap from yesterday, because you had no chance to remember what every single person said, and I didn't either. And I have one proposal for if you do another round. The names on the name tags have exactly the size in the font that it's impossible to read them if you're farther away. So yesterday when we were sitting in these 2 rows, but exactly the size that you couldn't call out someone from the other row. So next time I'm making bigger, and if I say you, that's just because it's too tiny. I tried to learn a couple of names, but I'm really slow in doing that. So as a recap, I'm the guy from the University of the Arts in Berlin. I run a part-time master program, and typically students that come to me, they, for instance, study design in a bachelor. They now run a group of people in an agency. They realize I'm not really a designer anymore. I kind of lead a design team. I've never learned how to lead anyone. I learned how to design. They never conceptually thought about creativity. They thought about how to design things. And so they come back to the university and said, I would like to have an academic discussion about how I actually do that. How do I lead a group of people that are supposed to create something where we're not exactly sure what the outcome will be, but we still need to have a client that says, that's exactly it. And so how do we do that? And then they come to me. And then I have another group of people that come to me that come from kind of boring organizations. They work for the Deutsche Bahn, like our train system, or they work for a large bank. And they say, well, I think we should be a bit more creative in our organization. I'm not really sure how to get that in, but I think studying at a University of the Arts might help me a little bit with that. So teach me. That's the people I have. And typically I do with them a class. It's a 12-week class. It's called Psychology of Creativity, where basically explain all the basics of creativity, and the people that come from design always have these aha moments where they say, that's interesting, that's actually what I do, but nobody has ever explained me how I do that, and now I can see if that happens. So my idea is I'm kind of over-prepared but under-structured. And I want to see where the discussion goes. It will probably be a bit eclectic because you have ideas and your inputs will take us into directions I have not planned to go into. But if I see in the faces of everyone else that this is kind of interesting, I'll be willing to go there. And we'll see where we end up in 70 minutes and if we have a feeling for what we should be doing the next 2 days. So my first question is, why bother? Why are we here? Why are we interested in getting better at teaching creativity? And I'll start with Michael, because we talked so much yesterday. Yes, and that's that rule. So we have, I think we have 1 or 2 mics, and I'll try to be quickly with the mics, otherwise it's not recorded. So why are we here? Why do we think it's important to have 2 days on how to teach creativity better?
Because creativity is getting more and more important. Uncertain times, we have to deal with new situations. And so creativity is maybe more important than it was 200 years ago.
And why is it more important?
I
Or
think
anyone else? You just pass it
precarious
on.
situation.
Because the world is getting more and more complex.
Okay, complexity.
There will be always situations where you need to find quick solutions, and therefore you need creativity. So it's never outdated.
Okay, so it's always good. That's great. That's like one of the few jobs that cannot be automated. Always be important.
I'd like to repeat it actually. So it's always good to find solutions for problems in these facing complexity.
Okay, solution.
And I have a personal thing that let me stay a bit childish. So that's why we need creativity.
Yeah, that's great. We just had a discussion about play. We'll get to that, I guess, a bit later. But it's one of the moments in life where we can actually be playful, and we seem to like that in a way. Everybody who has kids kind of like knows it's fun to do that again, and it's okay to do that. Yeah.
I think we all have to train every day our creativity to become better. I think creativity is not only important for people like designers, but also, as you said, the Deutsche Bahn.
Yeah.
They have to be creative on how to fix their trains and rails and stuff. So problem solving.
Fixings, problem solving.
So I'll just be myself and then be a business researcher. Then just say that it gives us comparative advantages. So we'll stay ahead in competition.
Competitive advantage. So basically the argument is if we aren't creative and the timeline is too long, then somebody else will be, and then they'll say, why does Sascha do all this old stuff? It's kind of outdated.
I think to enable students to be to be able to enable students to react on these changing situations and times.
React basically to an ever-changing environment. Full. You don't have to learn it by heart.
So my experience from my students is that the process is quite difficult to them to think in a creative.
So the creative process. So how to?
Yes, the creative process is pretty difficult,
yeah.
And this is actually what I would love to learn in these days to make this better. I mean, I have some strategies, but to overcome this barrier or this difficulty of thinking in a creative manner, I think it's not so easy.
Yeah. So basically, not understanding what the outcome will be, and kind of trusting that we'll get there eventually. I also have that with, I have roughly a third of the students comes from like the municipalities and governments, and they also have like a real pressure to be more creative within that system, but they are basically primed to think, and this is exactly the process that we have to follow. And kind of the, to me, the complex thing about a creative process, we'll get to it a little bit later, is because you get to a result that's different every single time, like the process is kind of a crutch, but you do it differently anyways. And so for them, it's always very, very hard to wrap their head around like letting go. And I cannot exactly tell you how we'll get there, but we'll get somewhere. And like, because they're so primed in thinking in like calendars and bullet points, and this is the first thing we do, this is the second thing we do, that they have a really hard time letting go. So I can totally relate.
Yeah, and I think it's a big chance also for us to, from our experience as design educators, So when there are situations where it worked with the students, I really want to know about that. I also have to tell about some situations where I realized they are able to start thinking in a different way. For instance, to make things worse. So speaking of Deutsche Bahn, how can they make their service even worse?
Oh, well, they're working
and they
on
come
it.
up immediately with lots of ideas. So being more unfriendly even, or not only delayed and stuff like that. So all these processes are super interesting to the education, to me. Thank you.
Perfect. So I see a couple of basically ways to group this. So one of the things that you talked about is like a fundamental thing that happens all the time. So we need to be creative to fix something that can be better in a way. That has always been the case, and that probably will also always be the case. And then we have a couple of things that are very like current. So we deal with a high level of complexity. So when I don't teach students that don't want to do an MBA at the University of the Arts, I run a research institute called Weizmann Institute. And we look at what does the digitization mean for society, and how can we help design it in a way that it's actually beneficial for us. And to me, automation and digitization always is a reason to think more about creativity. So these jobs in municipality that are very much standardized are an ideal situation to be automated if they put more effort into actually automating them. But the cases that don't really fit the standardized process will, for the foreseeable future, land on somebody's desk, and they have to find a clever way to deal with it. And in a nutshell, that's already something creative that they do. And I see these two patterns. So in general, it's something that humans need to do to fix problems, and it seems to be something that's very current. To me, I think you said this, the one with the play. So there's basically one trait to me it's a little bit missing. When I walk with students, I see very clearly it's also something that they want to do. So typically, if you are like a bureaucrat and you like went through all these processes the entire day, you don't really go home and say, this felt so great to do that. But it's kind of like the job and somebody has to do it. But if you have a class on creativity and they actually play and do something, and it works well, they kind of go home with a smile on their face. So it seems to be something that, to me, it's like the third pillar that people really want to do. And you're all here out of your free will. Nobody forced you to be here. So it seems to be a topic that really attracts us doing that. And if we look at what hobbies people have, oftentimes it's a creative hobby. Hardly anyone has a bureaucratic hobby where they say, I really like going through the phone book, but most of us probably have some kind of hobby, be it gardening, be it cooking, where we create something and we feel good about ourselves doing it. So it seems to be something that's in our nature that we feel happy when we do that. We did a study on remixing. So we looked at remixing in 3D printing communities, and we looked at this because they have to like give credit to a design that they remixed. So we could actually look into the network, how ideas travel. And typically, we always know that creativity means to recreate something that has been there before. But typically, you don't really know what was the thing that people took and then turned into something new. And there, we could actually see the idea. And then we did a study that looked at all the network data. And then we said, well, we need to talk to them. We talked to like 100 of these designers, and we asked them, what did you do? And roughly half of them said, well, I had to solve a problem. Like we needed a new hook for the bathroom. There was one. It was kind of too big, so I did a remix on it, and now we have this hook, and then I uploaded it for everyone else. And the other half said, well, I found this intriguing. I wanted to play around with it. I didn't know where this was going. And so they basically didn't try to solve a problem, but they played around with it. And by doing that, came up with something and said, that might be useful for somebody else, I'll upload that. And I always find that we call this like the process trigger in the paper we did about this. And I find this really interesting that we oftentimes have this concept that we say, well, we first need to start with what exactly it is that we try to solve. And by doing that, basically cut out half the processes of people that say, I'm really intrigued by the material. I want to play around with it and see what's going on. So I think it's a great part of creativity, but I think we're selling ourselves short if we say we only solve problems. Because oftentimes we solve something. There's a paper on the solution-problem duality, that oftentimes these solutions and problems, they don't come in a linear fashion. You start with a problem and say, now I have a solution. But specifically in digital environments, they kind of meet because somebody posted something, somebody else reads it and says, that's interesting. That might be something that I can turn into something I can work with. But I digress.
I think it's very important to start with what is creativity not. So when I giving classes on creativity, this is always the subject first, because we all are creative and we have like this everyday creativity, or if they're DJing or changing a color of something, this is not a creative solution. To make this clear, and then what we are looking for. So creativity is to ask the right question.
But you ask what it is, what is not. It's what it is not. So what should I put down for what it is not?
I hand this over to it's not like the everyday creativity. It's not just
even
like
though it's called everyday creativity.
Yeah,
that's
even then.
Okay, so you basically have a sort of like a threshold theory. You need to clear a specific threshold of complexity, and then it gets your stamp of that's creative. I'll consider that creative, but not that. So if I cook and like an ingredient is missing, and I think about I could probably use something else for that, you would then next to that that's not creative.
No, that can be creative.
Okay, it depends on what I pick.
Exactly. Okay. If it's tasty afterwards, it's good.
So I'll call that the threshold theory. I have this a lot because in patenting, for instance, you need to have a level of novelty that's not obvious. So if it's like the obvious thing and you say, well, we just added another screw, then the patent office will say, well, that's not really an invention. That's just an additional screw. And so I have this debate a lot, like, does it also apply to creativity? Is this like just another version of something that we had, or does it have to be fundamentally different than the thing we had?
I would say unexpected. This new thing, this from the process, or unexpected.
I'll do that also. Unexpected.
It's combining things interestingly.
Combination.
And there's the threshold again.
And you're also in favor of the threshold theory. Combination. I'll go like +1 on the threshold theory.
Yeah, so what I'm missing is really to be touched. So because I think we are really in a society full of information, full of strategies. But I think the most important thing of creativity is to be touched.
To be touched.
So yeah, and so the socialist here is describing to be getting in resonance with our world. So in this kind of digitalization, we are always so full of information, and everybody is creative.
Yeah.
But how you get to this kind of solution. And so I think it's quite easy to understand if you're listening to music or reading a poem. So there are people who trained themselves to spell the poem and say, but they're not touched.
Yeah.
And there are people who can figure out that there is the inspiration, and they get really inspired from this 3 lines of poems. And then they are open to get in this new fields of thinking. And this, I think, is the most important thing, to train people to get in touch with the world, to inspire it and open the mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this, I think, because everybody is, our world is full of creativity, I would say.
So you're against the threshold model. You say everything is kind of creative.
So, and how we get in touch. This is, I think, this is the most important thing.
I think it's a really important thing, because it means not only being in touch, but you're talking about there's some kind of an audience. So a lot of these things are like something we do new, but new has to be for someone.
I would like to add something, because I think it's very important what you said. I think it can, it's somehow demanding, or it's a demand, and it can thrive out of joy or out of fear. And you need curiosity and playfulness for this. And joy would be like coming from the heart and being touched. But when you think of Apollo 13, it comes out of fear, because they need to be creative in order to survive.
Yeah.
I would also like to add to that. For me, also creativity has some form of care. You have to care and put some love into it. Otherwise, it's not really anything creative.
So if I come up with a great substitute for the ingredient I'm missing while I'm cooking, but I don't really care, you say that's...
I would put it the other way around. Probably you don't really come up with something if you don't really care.
Okay. So you say, in order to be creative, I need to be interested in being creative.
Yeah, exactly.
I get it. Yeah.
I think one of you was saying that everybody can be creative, and in a way it has become very popular and like a lifestyle to be creative, and with creative cities and everything is creative, like a lifestyle in a way. But what is it really? Because I was also thinking of, it's kind of a process, and it's an outcome the same way. And just because everybody is having like tools with which we can be creative, I see it with our students, I often think, no, it's not creative just because you can pencil with your iPad or whatever. So what is it really? So I was also thinking of inventing something.
Invention, okay. So you're also in favor of the threshold.
And also find different ways of getting to the same outcome, but doing it differently, because we've got some things like environmental things that are really important, or social issues, and we have to find new solutions. And this is also creativity, I think.
Yeah. And I don't think you can invent anything without being creative in some sort.
Yeah, I want to join this and say it has to be an individual expression for the
individual expression. So you cannot be collectively creative?
You can, but I think it's first find yourself and find your individual expression, and what is it not? So kill your routines and try to something new.
So in psychology, there's something it's called the standard definition of creativity. So it's one of the few things where we actually have a standard definition that people kind of agree upon. And it basically has two parts. And you did the last one on, I think there was one on innovation. Innovation is kind of a very, very closely related definition. In creativity, to be considered creative, something has to be new. So if we do the same thing we did prior, so I don't change an ingredient, we will all say, well, this is business as usual, so it's clearly not creative. And the second part of the definition you kind of touched upon means it has to be useful. And useful is in the eye of the beholder. Doesn't mean it has to be like a patent, to be an invention where somebody can actually say, how can we monetize it? But it has to be useful for someone. So I can create something new by giving a typewriter to a monkey and say, write something. And the monkey will play with the typewriter, something will come up, which is kind of random. We would all agree that's new stuff. We will look at it, and probably none of us will say, that's very useful for me. But if I take the monkey and put it in a glass cube and say this is a metaphor for modern life, then you will say that's very clever, that's useful for me. So then it becomes useful. And so the standard definition of creativity doesn't have a threshold. It says the moment it's new and the moment it's useful, it's already a creative act. But like, of course, the literature is full of these debates. Well, is changing a little bit of one ingredient for another in cooking or replying to a WhatsApp text really something we need to train people to be creative simply because they write something new and say, well, I'll be at the train station at 5:75, and the other person said, well, that's useful information, I can do something. That's probably not what we're talking about here today. So there are all these models that say, well, creativity comes in these different parts, and it's very, very tough to differentiate this threshold, because the threshold is in the eye of the beholder. So you might have a book that you find really, really great, and you say, this is an eminent book, one of the greatest books ever written, and somebody else might read it and say, wasn't useful to me at all, I don't like it. And so typically in arts, we kind of have these communities that make these decisions. What is like the eminent literature? What is eminent design? And if we put together a different group of people that have different views on usefulness, they might come up with a different collection and say, well, that chair really, that's kind of like just because the guy was kind of good friends with the curator, but it's not really a great chair. We could change that for another one that was more useful. And then there's lots of debates what this socially means. But in general, something has to be new and it has to be useful. And the usefulness can also be within ourselves. So for instance, when we journal, so you wake up, you write what's going on, you write a diary, and you never have the idea that you want to publish this diary, but you still find it very, very useful to come up with these texts in your diary. It would still be considered a creative act, even though there's absolutely no audience, and the only person reading it and finding usefulness in it is yourself. So just as a very, very simple standard definition. So for me, next question we have to discuss is, when does it happen to you? When are you creative? Is this now? Is this someone else? What comes to mind when I ask you, when are you creative? Several people touched upon the creative process, so that seems to be something related to that, but please, wherever the microphone is, what's your take on when are you creative?
From a personal perspective, I think if we are in a constellation that brings us together as a community, that also brings and that creates a lot of creativity for me, that sparks a lot of curiosity and let's say having, I would say, like-minded conversations.
So when I talk with my students, typically this aspect is the one they all leave out. They always say like, it's when I'm, I don't know, hiking or even showering. So the shower example is, so I had a friend of mine now told me that he's an avid podcast listener, and he would put his smartphone on top of his rain shower. So even when he's showering now, he is it's not bored anymore. So we're even getting rid of the last.
So boredom.
Boredom.
So you need to be bored, I think, and you need to be the opposite, not stressed. I think stress is deadly for creativity.
Isn't Sally talking about like the exact opposite? You know? Okay. I thought it was creativity under pressure. But maybe pass on.
I wanted to say I'm horrible at time management, so I'm always creative every day, and I'm stressed every time I go out of my house. So I always have to be creative on how to do everything at once, and be in time. And it always works out. So I'm creative when I'm stressed.
You are creative when it's stressed, but you're also very confident.
Yeah.
So because you have the experience that it worked
Yes.
out every single time, so you have like a level of stress, but say, yeah, but
That's true.
it always works out for me. So you have a level of creative confidence.
I think having a shower, having a ride with a train or on bicycle, walking
is great.
Everything which keeps my body somehow in action, but I don't have to think about it. So then the mind can be free or freer. This is they do have all this in common. So you have to be somehow occupied with doing something else where you don't have to think about it.
Something else. So I have a colleague, and he's a law professor, and when they write text, it's a little bit different. So they don't have empirical data, but they construct an argument. And whenever he has to write a text, he invites the one or two people he thinks can probably contribute to this thought the most. He invites them to go hiking for several days. And what they do is they talk about his ideas. And he always said once he's done with the hike, the only thing he has to do is write the thing down, because it kind of emerged by hiking. So there seems to be some kind of a relationship between what we do sitting around or walking and what comes out of a creative process. It's kind of like this.
I'll give you this. I'll add one thing. Renee and I got to speak with an education researcher, Dan Schwartz. Sandy knows him well too. And we tried to learn from him what we've learned from neuroscience about learning. It was a little hard to get information out of him, I will say. Very interesting interview. But the one thing that he said was walking works. So there's actually evidence from neuroscience that walking makes our brain work differently. So I thought it was quite interesting. So walking works. We know that.
For me personally, I kind of oftentimes need to like jot things down, and but what I see is if I write a text and I really have to think about it, I walk through the house. So I go and get coffee, I go to the refrigerator way more often than is actually necessary, just to have some, I mean, I do it kind of unconsciously. I don't think about that's my strategy, how to come up with something, but I just see when I really have to think about something that I'm constantly running around and then go back to the desk, write something, run back, write something, just have a moment. And I used to have a boss, and she said, she actually, because we mentioned this several times, when she wrote a paper, she would shower like 5 times a day. That was kind of a process. She'd sit at home, write something, go shower, have an idea, write something back. So it's just very, very, very clean. So I think boredom actually is so Michael only touched upon this very briefly, seems to be a very important aspect of modern life, because we kind of got rid of boredom. Even if we are in a supermarket chain and there's like or a queue, there's 2 people in front of us, we cannot bear the situation. So we have to, there's somebody, you also to that, or, yeah, then please.
I need a challenge.
A challenge.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the boredom, because I think there's only a certain level of boredom that is healthy, and then it starts turning, because people that are not allowed to work, they should be very creative in that case, but there's a certain level of boredom that is healthy, and then it starts turning, and you don't feel empowered anymore, and then you are not so creative. So just saying be bit bored more often is not is not the solution to every problem in becoming more
so there seems to be some kind of like an equilibrium. So
or a
we
balance,
can be
or however you want to call it.
In Germany you say you're überfordert, unterfordert. If we're like constantly
burn out and bore out or something.
if you're like constantly bored out, and basically unterfordert, it's not only bored, but it's also that like the complexity of the task is not really at the level of your thinking. So you kind of feel like, I would have to do this again, I'm kind of like, and then you're not getting into something we would call like a flow state, where you say, this is actually a challenge for me, but it's too easy. I've done this 100 times, it's not really interesting. Then it becomes boring, but not in a way that like sparks ideas, but more like, I have to do this again. We have...
Yes, I would also like to comment on boredom and differentiate it a little bit. I think it's, to me, it's more the absence of distraction And I feel from what we've been saying now, it seems to be something, of course, to everyone it's a little bit different. What are the conditions that are required to be creative? But it seems to be an oscillation between an on and off state. So it seems to be something, of course, if there is a complete absence of material ideas input, I can't be creative. But so I need something that kind of serves as a hook, or that
So you
gets
need
me
an
into the
absence of
creative.
distraction plus a hook.
Yes, exactly. So it's a bit a kind of on and off mode, or the absence and presence.
And so is your typical problem that you would say you have too much distractions to be creative, or is it too little hooks?
I think it's the right combination of this. And I think that's a challenge in our contemporary
So basically
society.
to design the process in a way that it is inspiring on the one hand, but not too inspiring to not get distracted on the other hand.
Exactly.
So you actually have the time to work on. I think we had like in the back two before.
Just very short. One thing that just came to my mind. I don't know how to describe it perfectly, but a distance. So I'm very creative when I look at it the next day or after 2 days. So this time to mature or to this
distance. Yeah, I would also.
Even if it's time or distance. Well, create the same thing, but to have this virgin look at it or on it the next day or after 2 days.
I think in the back several.
I want to add another thing. Is when I was a younger designer, I remember that I had a challenge, and I said, "Okay, today I'm going to hike, and I will be very creative," but it didn't work. And next day I will go to swim and it didn't work. So I want to add about the distance is something that I call let it go. Don't think about it. Probably suddenly it will come out, even if you are in conversation or just looking at something. So just let it go.
Yeah.
And probably something will be there because it's from your influence, from inspiration, from many things. So when you don't think about it, actually, I think for me, I'm getting more creative.
So you think about it. So we have like now finally in the back. So you think about it by not thinking about it.
I think at least you need to have trust in your own creativity. Because if you do not think that it leads to something, you need not to be creative. So I think you need a goal, and a goal for the individual or a goal for the community or what else, for the collective. And nevertheless, if it's a good goal or a bad goal, that can also be, but you need trust in your own that it leads to something.
Trust. And I think it's not only trust, but to me, it's so we all can be creative in like a 90-minute workshop because it's fun and engaging, and then we get something out of it. But I have to supervise PhD students who kind of have to do something for several years. And I see that they not only need the confidence that something will come out, but they also need to believe that this is actually something that should exist. And so if they at some point lose, so some PhD students start a PhD process because they think it would be great to have the title to be a PhD. And this motivation kind of wears off over time. And after a year or 1.5, they'll say, well, it's kind of a lot of work just for a couple of letters in front of your name, so I might do something else now. So if you're not interested in the product itself that's created, it seems to be like if you don't trust that the thing that comes out actually has value, then over time that seems to have a bigger effect on us actually being willing to be creative with that. So I see that a lot with PhDs, yes.
Yeah, that's right. So you really have to want it. Want to find a solution. And I guess what you said is also like this incubation phase where you have to ask the question, and then it needs time, because I guess we will learn something about neuroscience in today or tomorrow, that we, our brain, of course, tries to find solutions even when we are not consciously thinking about it.
Yeah. So, what I find interesting about this, when are you creative, is that given that we have such a very wide understanding of creativity, so are we talking about writing an entire PhD for several years, or talking about having like an aha moment for like an individual thing, how we could do that? Both seems to be kind of important for creativity, but they seem as a process to be kind of different things. So this is what you probably talked about. So this is like 100-year-old book, which you can probably explain. It's called The Art of Thought. Back then, the concept of creativity wasn't around. It only came up in the literature, I think, after the Second World War. And he wrote a book about like how new thoughts emerge. And the thought is like basically a micro form of creativity. So it's not the entire book, but how do like novel ideas come to life? And he broke this down into, I think back then it was only 4 steps, and then a 5th one was added. And the first one is, and we haven't really talked about this here because this was more of a temporal when, but he says everything starts with preparation. If you have no idea, if you write a PhD and you have no idea about the literature, what's already there, what you can add, then probably nothing is going to happen. So, and also when we have this very simple example that doesn't clear your threshold theory about me cooking and changing an ingredient, then probably having cooked a lot of times before and having like experience with it will help in the creative process. And then several people mentioned this, like not thinking about this. We basically have this problem that goes into the back of our brain, and then at some point we have this illumination where our brain says, here's an idea, try this. And it probably somewhere unconsciously tried several others, but they weren't interesting, and then it came up with some, said, this is this aha moment, somebody showers. For me, it's typically always when I need to go to bed. My brain gets very active when it's supposed to shut down, and then like ideas emerge, and then I kind of write them down, or I walk around. And once we have this aha moment, we kind of go into an evaluation mode and say, well, does this actually work? Is this just an idea, or is this something that we can work with? And then once we have this evaluation, then we really need to like write it down, type it out, paint it, and do whatever with it. So a very simple, very old process, but I think still kind of valuable, because in mostly when we talk about creativity, because there isn't like this one, you have to follow these 5 steps and every single time you come up with an idea, then maybe we take this and jump to the next question, which we've covered a little bit, and you can start. What is your personal creative process? So if you have to do something, how do you design that? Do you have one, or is it just randomness?
So it's just like, I think the preparation process, of course, is just to maybe to get everything out of it. So having this mind mapping, brainwriting, whatever, just start with whatever is in your mind at the moment to put this out first.
Getting things out. Whoever hasn't spoken so far.
Yeah, I agree. To make some sketches, you don't know really what you are doing, and like doodling or searching for something that you really don't know. And if it's catch your mind later, you can develop it.
Yeah.
The mind wide open.
What does it mean? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah. Not focus. The opposite of focus, just
opposite of focus.
So for me, it's serendipity. So because we are always collecting some information. So this school of seeing, I would say, and just kind of saving it in your brain.
Can you explain what that is and how that works?
So it's finding solution for problems or things you haven't searched for.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of how is it called? Zufall. Accidentally. Yeah. And I think it's for me the main topic is always the illumination. So in our fast life, to be really recognizing these small sparks that appear every time, and to just grab them and think about, okay, is it worth to work on that further on?
So in English, it's a very common word. In German, hardly anyone uses it because we really like processes, and coming up with something by accident, that's not a process, that's an accident. But maybe we can talk about this a little bit. So I think that the concept itself is like roughly 250 years old. Once did a video about it. It's like some English guy who invented the graphic novel, not that the Gothic novel came up with it by explaining how he accidentally, I think, found a painting that was kind of lost, and he like stumbled upon something, and he said he actually did this like a fairy tale of three princes of Serendip, which I think was the old word for Sri Lanka, if I remember correctly. And then 200 years, nothing happens. Nobody cares about the word. Nobody cares about the letter the guy wrote. And then I think like 50 years ago, something like that, Robert Merton, who did a lot of work on how science works, came across this word and says, this actually explains a lot of scientific discoveries. They don't start with a question and then they need to find a solution to exactly that question, but they seem to stumble upon something and then they say, that's interesting. So we several times had this word of curiosity. And yes, maybe.
If I want to be creative, the first thing I want to have is a vision, a vision. Also, how should it feel? What does it do? What does it make for the person looking at it or using it? It's like these little quarks. You cannot fix all points. How does it look like? How does it feel? And what comes out? And then after that, I can go to collect ideas and make serendipity, make this chaotic process coming. But first, I need a feeling for what should be the outcome.
A feeling for what's kind of interesting.
The impression.
So for me, serendipity, basically several things have to come together. So if it's like a happy accident where you run into something where you say, I haven't expected that, we kind of need to find a way to invite that happy accident into our lives. So for me, oftentimes, it's just having conversations with different people. If I go to lunch with like the same bunch of colleagues every single day, and we go to the same place every single day and eat the same meal every single day, then that might be very streamlined, but it's kind of unlikely that I stumble upon something where I say, I haven't heard that before. That's a clever idea. So getting out, talking to people, finding things, reading odd books, things where like other people haven't looked into might be helpful to stumble upon something that other people haven't stumbled upon. What I find interesting in that regard is like another concept from the same guy who came up with the Matthews effect. And the Matthews effect basically means that the rich get richer. And what I find is when we do things online, they're typically ranked. So if you go to Instagram and you look for a specific topic, you find the very same pictures that everybody else finds who looked for the same question. And then it's not the odd thing that nobody else has seen, but it's the common thing that everybody. And I find that paradoxical because we always think that like digitally we're connected to the entire world, yet we seem to get a very specific snapshot, which oftentimes is very similar to what others see. So I was in Indonesia a couple of years ago, and I was in a mall, and in this mall was a hip, cool cafe. And this cafe had like these little French bar stools, I think, like these workshop stools, toliks, I think they're called. And they're completely out of place in Indonesia. And I was writing a book there and sitting there the entire day and thought about this. And then I realized it's probably some interior architect who Googled hip cafe and found all these Parisian cafes that have like these Tolix shares. And he said, we need these shares, and shipped them to Jakarta, and now had like these out of place French hip cafe that was like totally Instagrammable somewhere in a mall in Sri Lanka because he found the very same thing. But I digress.
I think it's a mixture of coincidences and planning things. And I've got for me, it feels like there's always a track parallel in my mind running, looking for things, being aware of things which might pop up. So there is always something in the background, maybe in the unconsciousness, and I'm ready to jump on it when I accidentally find something.
Michael,
I think there's not one, or I don't have one creative process. It depends.
Yeah.
So I see if I want to find out a new idea for a book chapter or a paper, I would say, okay, let's think about this, and I go cycling. And I had a conversation a few days ago with Daniel Wahl from Regenerative Design, and he said, I wrote the last book on the bicycle. Yeah, thinking on the bicycle. But on the other hand, if I would talk with students, I would say, start working with the material. And you will get your ideas from working with your material in the process. Like when I'm cooking. I have no idea what to cook, but I have peppers and onions and tomatoes, and let's see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So I think oftentimes if we have like these creativity methods or these processes, they try to put something that is very not only different, but also individual and kind of context specific into like a very clear form and format. So I have the very same thing. With my PhD students, I always tell them to go back to the data, to look at like when they're stuck, like what does the data tell you? And then you might find an idea and then you can go on with that. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I would also say the same, because also in the process you need the failure, because because you have this vision, you have this idea not clear in your mind, and then you find to collect all these important things, and then also this hands-on to try out, and then to see, oh, so my vision or my idea has nothing to do with the output. And it's really frustrating, because also I train my students often to put it in paper, hands-on, make your first prototyping, because then they said, oh, you see my idea. And I said, no. So, what's about? Yeah, I thought it's so, it's a hook and it should be a jewelry or necklace. I don't know. And I said, I don't see it. Yeah. So, and this is awesome. I have this also somehow for my clients, so you have, this vision, but then you have to really find the process. And I have quite a few of strategy because we are often in professional wise in pressure.
Yeah.
To make the presentation fix and have a clear idea. And often I have no clear idea. I have not the clue. Yeah. So I didn't manage it in this kind of schedule. And so for the students, I think it's quite important to see, it's failed. There is, I have to start again.
Yeah.
Because the vision was not clear. So I need, and this kind of process I love, to be honest. To see what I aimed for is not on the paper.
Yeah.
And how we get in this hands-on process to trust our idea, although we see it's not fixed.
Yeah, so it seems to be a process that's somehow iterative, that we go back and make it better, that we collect feedback and say we could change that. I once had a PhD student, and he had this great concept, and he said, if you write a paper, you can make it better, make it better, make it better, but then there comes a point where it only gets different. And the tricky part is to recognize we're at that point now. Like when we change it, we might get a different paper, but it's not necessarily a better one. And that's the moment you need to jump ship and say it's gone. But if you do it the first time, it's very, very tricky to find that thing. You get feedback and people say, I absolutely don't understand what this is about. And you feel like, but I put my heart and soul into that. I don't want to edit this. And then you get reviews back and you say, this is heart crushing. This doesn't work for me. But over time, you kind of develop a feeling for what's this tipping point where feedback actually only changes it in a way, but doesn't necessarily create a better paper or a better book. Anyone else?
I just want to say that this is all like the serendipity out of focus, but honestly, my creative process is quite structured. So I do start with a definition of the purpose and problem and what I want to work on, and then do research, and that's where I get my inspiration. So like this is part of it, but I get there by way of actually starting with a pretty clear search for where I want to go.
And you always do that, or you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's how I get started, right? I think about what am I trying to do and what do I need to be creative in service of? And then I do that, and it seems to be working.
I think one thing that we can take away from this is that it's a very subjective thing. And I think that is what we oftentimes struggle with, because if we are in organizations, we try to standardize specific things and say, this is how it's done. And when I look at the people I work with, how they come up with good ideas, it's a very different route that they take. And the tricky thing is to find one that works for you. So there's always also the complexity with a creativity method. It's a little bit like these self-help books that tell you, this is how I started getting my calendar organized, which means it works for you and you got a book deal because of that, but that doesn't mean that I can do exactly the same thing. And so for me, I think it's always important to like see and learn how other people do that, and then basically mix and match so it fits with your personal style and personal interest. And I see in many organizations that I work with that they have a real issue with allowing this amount of subjectivity and like a personal way of doing that, because they really would like to have like one common way of doing it. We'll talk later a little bit about like the environments that we work in, and I think this is like the most specific one, that we have someone who like standardizes how offices look and say this is how it should work, and then we don't really want people to turn this into like their own environment. And I think with the process it's very much the same thing. Yes, please.
I would like to add, when I start the creative process with my students, I call it an open research process, and I love to go with them in art exhibitions, because this makes them open their mind. And then 1 hour, 1 week later, we are talking about it. I think talking about and exchanging ideas and what I gathered or my findings to change them, gets us new ideas.
Yeah, I think this is especially valuable if you get started. So we do the same thing with students. We have like an art historian who does a class with me on design and creativity, and he goes with them every weekend into at least 2 exhibitions, talks them through that, simply to get them into thinking I could create something creative. And we always have this with PhD students, that they would like to have like a writing retreat where they go somewhere else to really focus on being creative. And I see the more experienced people are, the more they can squeeze stuff in. So they sit at an airport for 20 minutes and they come up with an idea, because they kind of have this process down. And I think that the earlier you are in your career, the more you get started, the more it helps to really decontextualize, get them out of where they typically are and give them into an environment that's really like inspiring for them to start with the motivation to work on something. So we do exactly the same.
Sometimes I actually work on most silly ideas, most like wild ideas, and then I try to just change some aspects of it. So like, what if it was in this context and that context, so that it's basically it's challenging the known assumption, but it still has this usefulness aspect to it. So that's how I also work on it.
So what would be an example?
Something that doesn't make sense, like that goes against our common sense, for example.
Okay, so when you have to do a presentation, you think about what could be like the worst opening.
Things that, things people.
No, I love it.
Like something that people might laugh at you, for example, and then you wanna add some more materials to it so that you're not rude, for example.
Okay.
You know,
What could be like the rudest opening?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, something like that. You know, like that's what I do when I really want to be creative. Yeah. But I go for really like a wild ones first.
Yeah.
So I'm pushing myself to be creative, like in the first place, and then I'll try to add to this usefulness, those things that you need to, count.
Yeah.
And then
What I like about it is it has like a level of empathy in it where you think about like the usefulness for a specific audience. And if you say, well, what would be rude for them? You already are in their like position and think that would be rude for them because of that. And so you kind of empathize with them and then don't develop like the most usual, but the one where you kind of like from their perspective, that's probably the one. I like the idea.
I can build on that, and we did it in a group, and that was come up with a silly idea, and the next person is not allowed to put it down, but needs to say how it would work. So it's real fun to come up with absolute ideas that you think will never work, and the next people have to say how they might make it work.
And they did.
Gets your mind twisted.
Yeah. We in Germany we have this concept of a Bedenkenträger. So somebody, so basically, it's very rough to translate that. So it's, if you are in an organizational setting and you suggest something, then this is the person who comes up with why this wouldn't work and why this is against policy. And so we had one of those in an earlier institute, and we tried to do something like that, like an yes and session. So they really had to build on, and it drove them crazy. They were like scratching the table, like, I need to tell you why this doesn't work. This is what I always do. I can't tell you how this works. Like this is not my job. So I like this. Yes. Anything else? Yes, please.
I just want to build on something you said a little bit ago that I think comes back to something you also said earlier. So clearly it's in your research. But a thing I noticed looking at teams, so coming from the context of a design company who has a structured process as a starting point, not always sticking to it, but a starting point. We also had project leaders, a person who would structure that process for a team. And we're always working collaboratively, not individually. But some project leaders would kind of create the frame and then say, okay, now let's be creative. Like now let's fill in the blanks, because that was their creative process. And some project leaders would say, let's all just sketch, come up with ideas and see what we come with, because that was their creative process. But different people have different processes for organizing that. We heard it in the room. So I just wanted to say, like, the most advanced project leaders could understand what each person on their team needs and be nimble between those two environments, so that it wasn't always one or the other. Because where team members got stuck is if the process was always the thing that didn't work for them. Sometimes that actually helped them, but when it was always the opposite way, they got very frustrated and felt like they couldn't create. So just validating that. I think you called it problem solution earlier. But
but I think that's actually a very a great observation. That's exactly. So if I have this process that works for me and try to like take my entire group and say, this is how you have to think creatively, very quickly they get to a point where that doesn't work for me. I don't shower 5 times a day. Like, why this? And just if you then only tell them like you have to trust the process, at some point they kind of get demotivated in doing that. So understanding what they need. We had this like very early, I think John was it, when we said like what makes you creative, he said community, like the other people. And so finding a way that they actually add to one another in a way that, again, very like empathetic, understanding what they bring and how that helps the group. But that needs a lot of experience in having like groups like that.
And it needs experience, but also metacognition. So especially we've got design educators in the room helping people know their own process, number one, which is great, to be metacognitive of that, but also that other people have different processes to be aware of that. And also that we can structure in different ways that actually use those two advantages in different times for different purposes.
Absolutely. And I think this is oftentimes why like our students come back to university because they're exactly at that point. They say, well, I learned how it works for me. I became a good designer, and that's why I got promoted into a team lead. And I recognized like my skills don't really, like I could tell them how I would do it, but that's not exactly what my job is. My job is to like work with people to the best of their abilities and to help them to create something that I couldn't create. And if I just tell them this is how I would do it, please fill in the blanks, and that's not really creative for them. And then they come back to university and say, I need to understand how to do exactly that. So that's perfect. Maybe one more thing we haven't touched upon, which typically always comes up, which is this differentiation between if we come up with a solution space, widen that, but typically it's called divergent thinking, or if we basically say, this is now the decision that we come up with, the one outcome that we work with. So you all are probably familiar with this. What I find interesting is the effect of digitization on it. So because of COVID, we moved an awful lot of meetings online, and we now see results of what does that mean for creative work. And if we are in a group and we think divergently about what we could do this afternoon, and we come up with ideas and we cut into each other's sentences, and we kind of see, because somebody raises an eyebrow, that person wants to speak, we are very much in this room, talk with each other and come up with a widening of a solution space. And we see that this is very, very tough online, because we have such a much larger cost for switching between speakers. So here, even though we are a large room, I see if somebody wants to say something, and we can very quickly get a mic to you, and so you can cut in and say, I have an idea. If we would do the same thing online, somebody tries to find the button to raise a hand, somebody moderates it, somebody shouts in, Annette wanted to say something. I say, I haven't seen that. I ask Annette, she says, it's 5 minutes ago. It's not really relevant anymore. So we can do that kind of okay-ish if we're a very small group, 2 people on the phone, we can like jump in, but the larger the group gets, the more difficult this part becomes if we do it digitally. Convergent thinking, so if we have options, we now want to decide which of these options works best for us, is a very different story, because we can kind of do that based on rounds. So we can say, everybody, we go through what your opinions are, what your ranking is, and then we go to the next one. So we can kind of do that online. So I find it interesting that we now have these technologies that have a direct effect of how we work together. And we oftentimes, so the number one issue if I give talks in organizations currently is how much percentage should people be allowed to work from home. So in Germany, we would like to have everything in a rule, and so a percentage is a great rule. And they never really think about the tasks that people do and what they are, how this could help them, like how working jointly together, serendipitously come across something that they might only do in the office, but they always think in like a percentage that they can apply to all. And I think it's a great example for how the devil is kind of in the details when we work creatively, and that this might be great to do from home, this might be an absolute nightmare, and we still think we do something creative, but it's just another aspect of that very same thing. So the next thing, time's kind of running. 2 more topics to cover. So we kind of touched upon aspects of this already, but given that you all have students that try to be creative, and several people said everybody can be creative, my next question would be, what makes a person creative? And my idea is that we think about it for 2 minutes, and then maybe we chat with our neighbors, and then we see what you came up with and put that together. Ingmar, I'd like to go first because I have the mic right next to you.
Yes, our answer would be to be open-minded.
Open-minded.
And to be able to create a comfortable time, situation, whatever. Is that correct?
Is that correct? Open-minded.
It's correct, and we
So
call
in,
it Ausgangslage in German.
In psychology, you have these big 5 character traits, like neuroticism and openness to new experiences is the only one like that across the board. And explain a little bit what that means. It's always good for creativity. So if you aren't open-minded and you really hate new ideas and you hate inspiration and you would like to do the same thing every single day, then I think we can all agree that this is probably not the best predictor for being creative. And the other thing was creating a situation.
A situation where you feel comfortable.
Comfortable.
To let it flow. Is that correct? I always have to.
A comfortable situation. Yes, please.
Maybe we also discussed that there was someone who said I can only work under pressure.
Yeah.
But I believe that even then you need to find a way to for somehow comfortable situation to start.
So it's a very I guess it's a subject comfortability.
I'm sorry, I would like to disagree.
On which one? On open-mindedness or comfortable?
No, to the comfortable situation, because I think oftentimes it's limitations, it's really difficulties which make us creative.
Yeah.
So for my students, I often set limitations so they become more creative. And my best example is always think of people in jail. They become really creative to get out of jail. Seriously.
Yeah.
Yes, so we talked about having a goal. So, and we agreed on that extrinsic motivations to get a prize, to get a whatever loafer is not the best one. The best one will be, of course, to be intrinsic motivated, and how to get someone to accept the challenge. So to see the value in a possible solution.
The challenge. So before we collect more, so I think that there seems to be somehow some kind of a tension. If we are under too much stress, that might lead us not to. So for instance, if you are very time constrained in a task, you might take the very obvious route because you don't have enough time to actually explore options. So maybe that's a way of having a comfortable resource to think about that. On the other hand, there is lots of work on limitations and how limitations have a value for coming up with something. I once wrote a book about creativity roughly 10 years ago, and then I realized there's 2 types of people. There's people that think they aren't creative and they don't buy books on creativity. And then there's people that think they are creative and they don't buy books on creativity. So don't do that. But back then I did lots of research on examples, and for limitations, the one that I found that I really liked, maybe some of you remember, there was this movie called The Artist, and it's a silent film in, I think, 2012. And it got the Oscar for Best Movie because they had such a playful and creative way to act around the fact that they can't speak. And they wouldn't have won Oscar for Best Film if it would just be a regular film, because the story isn't that great. But the fact that they couldn't speak opened up creative avenues. So there absolutely seems to be some value in limiting something. And there's this saying that the worst thing you can do to a director is tell him or her that you can do whatever you want. And then you're kind of overburdened with what that means. The limitations seem to have a role. And then you touched upon motivation. And motivation to me is, I kind of talked about it a little bit, but these creative stamina, this longevity of coming through something. So we differentiate these 2 types of motivation: extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation. We all kind of agree that we like money, and if people pay us more money, we'll probably not stop thinking, but that for any creative act, we had this before with this illumination, this incubation, so our brain really needs to want to do it. So if we aren't interested in the topic at all and we aren't intrinsically motivated to work on it, then it's very unlikely that the brain will say, I have a great, Herbert Simon calls it networks of possible wandering. So like in our brain, what could we connect? And if we are absolutely disinterested in it, then it's very unlikely that we will say that this is a great. And for me, I think many people start very motivated, intrinsically motivated with a topic because creativity is playful, it's great. For me, always the great issue is how can we find a way that stays that, so that they are not stuck and say, I only do it for money, I do it extrinsically. Or in the example of the PhD candidate for the title, it's also an extrinsic motivation where you say, well, then I'm Dr. Sascha Friesike, and people will put that on my Klingelschild. And but it's not a motivation that gets you up at night and says, that's a great thought. So where's the mic? Yes, please.
Thank you. Well, we talked about, first of all, we talked about what enables a person to be creative, because we realized there are two different understandings of the question. And we came up with a safe space. So that maybe takes the comfortable situation a little bit further and qualifies it in a different way. We think a safe space is really important to make people creative. It needs to be a space where they can voice any kind of idea without having fear of being judged. And yes, and then Anke, I don't know, do you want to tell the story? So, Anke came up with something that related to it that we found really interesting, that during her studies, she realized that some people always came up with apparently very simple ideas. And Anke said she only realized several semesters into the degree how brilliant these ideas were. And these, all of these students who belong to this group seem to have frequented a Waldorfschule. Anke kind of concluded that these young people had a confidence and had learned from early on that they could trust to be valued positively with whatever they came up. So yes, we realized maybe some people are also better equipped to be creative because they have this very valuable foundation.
Yeah, it's a great point. So Michael, in 1 second. There's this model, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's, I really like it. It's called the Amusement Park model of creativity. You're familiar with it? Yeah, some are, some aren't. Anna, you want to explain? No. So basically it's a metaphor, and I like thinking in metaphors. And it says, if we think about creativity and who is creative and how they are creative in different domains, it might be helpful to have a metaphor of a trip to an amusement park. And so they do that on several levels. They say on a very initial requirements level, we need to have time to go to an amusement park, have a free day, and the family needs to be interested to actually doing that. And once we have cleared that, we can then say, well, what kind of an amusement park should we go to? Do we want to do water slides, roller coasters, or would we like to look at animals? And then we pick a very specific one as a domain. We say we go to the Berlin Zoo. And even in the Berlin Zoo, there's very different animals that we can look into. And they map that onto creativity. And what you said, they call an initial requirement. An initial requirement is, for instance, our motivation. So if we aren't motivated, probably not much going on. Then we have a connection between intelligence and creativity, but it kind of means after a certain amount of intelligence, it kind of flatlines. Depends also on the microdomain. So if you are number theory and mathematics, you probably need to be more creative than if you do other types of creativity work. And then they talk about the environment. So the environment in the moment that we work creatively, but also the environment before. And I think environment because John mentioned it earlier, is something that's oftentimes overlooked as the social construction of kind of who we are and how we learn to look at things, but also in the way where we work. So this also relates to what you said as a safe space. If many people that say, and that didn't buy the book, that they aren't creative, actually mean they aren't creative here, which means they might be creative in a different environment, and they are, for instance, very creative in their sports club or at home with their family, but in the work environment, they don't feel very creative because the environment doesn't help. And the model tries to map the very general discussion we had about creativity to very, very specific domains. So if we, for instance, think about creativity in science, in communication, or in art, then these are very different tasks that we talk about, but still they need to come up with something creative. And if we then go down one level to the domains, we can say even in art, there's a big difference between someone who does poetry, where specific character traits might actually be helpful that aren't really helpful if you do number theory and mathematics, or we have a differentiation between someone who does journalism or builds sculptures. And then on a micro domain, we have even differences within journalism, with the type of journalism that they do. And specific attributes of who we are might not help us in general to be more creative, except for like the openness to new ideas, but they might be very helpful in a specific micro domain. So if you are in science and you are a very rigorous person, that might be very helpful there. But if you do poetry, it might be not as helpful, because it's maybe more helpful if it's very quickly and exactly encapsulates a specific feeling. And so for me, it kind of helps to structure this like abstract concept of creativity in general to very specific domains that ask for different things that we do with them. But no, Michael.
So I'm not sure creativity is limited to some people. I think everyone is creative. Yeah. Andreas Schleicher from the PISA study says, okay, 10-year-olds are more creative in our tests than 15-year-olds. Yep. What's going wrong? So it's a human thing. We had a really interesting conversation, and we started talking about the right environment where your creativity can unfold. And then the right conditions, that it's an inspiring setting and so on, which made me realize this is kind of like in a corporate context. Yeah. When we go back and look at indigenous people like Polynesian navigators and their ships, or the Inuit, there are wonderful books and legends about the creativity of the Inuit, how they make with very limited materials like sinews and skin and, well, snow, build their houses from snow and so on. So the limitations that are here and the constraints are so important and I realized in my own processes when I started teaching and so unlimited freedom is overpowering students. I can do open-ended workshops with professors of cybernetics, and PhD students are a little bit confused, but the younger students need this kind of structure. And so I realized, where everything is possible, it is really hard for something to become actual and real. So we need limitations, we need the constraints. And in an office, this would be time, money, people. We are 3 people, and we have to be done in 2 weeks, or we have to be done in 6 weeks.
Yeah. I have the very same thing with these the structure and confusion. Like how much confusion can you put into a room? How much is like a good amount of confusion? That this is helpful not to have like the first idea that comes to mind. But again, there is a certain tipping point afterwards. It gets very complicated. Okay. Yeah.
I might have a very unpopular opinion because I come from a world where we are very creative in breaking people's bones and noses and stuff like that. And I do think, which is martial arts, it sounds very hard, but I do like the concept of maybe fear of rejection. I think we live in a world where more and more we create safe spaces and they get smaller and smaller and smaller because we don't get taught that actually rejection doesn't hurt me. And I think what I like to, there's this biology model that will go back later in my workshop, but I think maybe there is a slight problem, I just want to drop it, in creating ever bigger safe spaces that people are actually getting less creative. I think it's exciting because I live in a world where you have to get creative by, in not getting hit, for instance. And it's not necessarily a safe space as we classically define it. It's more of, can you create a safe space within something that might not feel safe? And can you understand your nervous system, which we'll hear about a lot later, probably. And I think it's a lesser liked but good thesis, or interesting thesis at least, to always bring in that safe spaces, open-mindedness. All of those things are also only one side of maybe this medal of creativity, I believe.
So it's an interesting point where you say, well, there is a relationship between the challenge that I'm accepting and the motivation to do that, which I think is not necessarily a different opinion from having a safe space, because even in martial arts, you practice and you train something new and you can do that to get better, which doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. But if you don't like the team you practice with at all, and they always bully you, you're probably not going back to practice. I once played at a...
But that's an interesting question, because I do think there's a difference between enlarging your safe space or having other people do it for you. And we live in a world in which we tend to expect others to create our safe space.
Yeah.
And I think there's a slight problem there, because actually I have a lot of kids that don't want to come to judo the first 4 months because you get thrown around.
Yeah.
And I do tell them, listen, this is a part of life. It's a part of life getting thrown around, so get used to it. Very friendly for the rest, but there I'm very strict. And I think there's a difference in that sense. Are you enlarging your safe space, or are you having other people cushion you in that sense?
I think you can even make a philosophical argument, and this would probably, because time's running out.
Sorry,
but I think it's a very interesting philosophical argument, like how much individual freedom can other people accept from others, and what's the collective consequence. And my favorite example is architecture. So where my wife is from, in Lower Saxony, they have an area where they could build new family homes. And basically the rules seem to have been anything goes. And so they have a Swedish log cabin next to a marble mansion, next to something that looks like a Texan ranch. And individually, they feel very that this is exactly the house that they wanted to have. But as a community, there isn't a sense of anything common in that. And so everything I drive by, I think every time I drive by, I think it might be a philosophical argument to be made, how much individualism do you allow within a community? I don't think we'll solve that in 5 minutes, but I think it's absolutely something that will resonate once you write a text about it, and that a lot of people grapple with. There's 2 more, and I have you already for the next and last question. When you start the next question, we'll do her first, and then I'll get to you. Yes.
Maybe connecting with the last speaker, it is essential to deal with other people, or being able to deal with other people. Not only being open-minded, but letting everything in and listening to it and dealing with it, because nobody is an island and you have to.
It's called a collaboration imperative. We kind of have to work together.
We were also talking about it, seeing different perspectives, to see other views, and this makes us creative. And we were talking about we need a kind of personal development, challenge, competition. So this makes us creative too.
Yeah. Also, which we talked earlier, a flow state. If it's too tough, we'll say, I can't do that. If it's too easy, then we'll say, that's not really a creative thing. So maybe, because time's running out, to sum this up, we have talked about the things we need to bring to the table. We haven't really talked much. Typically, when I ask this question, people talk way more about character traits. I haven't talked about this much, but this model helps that the specific character traits are helpful in specific microdomains. They aren't an initial requirement except for openness. We've talked a lot about the experience, the expertise we bring to the table. So if we have absolutely nothing to add, it's very unlikely that as the outside voice, we might really make a difference in creativity. But it also means working together, bringing different voices together might help us to come up with something that we on our own won't. We talked a lot about motivation. So this seems to be like the engine that keeps everything going. And if this kind of goes out because we aren't motivated, we don't accept the challenge anymore, we find it too easy or too complicated, or we're simply not in it for the long run, then creativity kind of goes away. And then we talked a lot about the fact on the slide before that this is a very personal thing. So we, for ourselves, need to find a way to work creatively. But given that we work with people together, we also, as Sally pointed out, need to find a way to do that in a way that fits with the people we work together. And now I think it was you yesterday, I have the last question, because you said that was you with the messy desk, wasn't it? Please say it.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay. This bit. I love this comment from the guy from the martial arts position somewhere there. In general, everything is right what we said now, but it's very important to understand that creativity, to work creative, is very exhausting. Takes a lot of energy. It's like a sport, and you get better and better as more as you do it. And the most important thing I learned as a teacher is that you need a break. You need breaks. If you be creative, you need a lot of breaks. Otherwise, and it ends in a catastrophe.
It's perfect. We do that in 2 minutes. It's my cue. Maybe one more thing on your messy desk. So, what space makes you creative?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I think typically I was studying at a university where there's a super creative young people. At the Royal College of Art, a very few selected guys who should go to the car industry. So what happens to them? They got really good jobs in the car industry, and the car industry built design offices, really beautiful and very kind of scary because they are so big. And so these fantastic creative guys, they lost their confidence there. So what you need, they asked me how to do such a space for designers. I said, build them little garages in a big hall somewhere, and give them a key, and they can do in this garage what they want. Then they will be creative. Don't sit them on glass desks and expensive chairs in the center of London. That doesn't work.
Yeah. It's a great observation. I kind of laughed suddenly yesterday when you mentioned your messy desk, because I always say, when you look into my office, it's an exact picture of what's going on in my brain. Like if I'm working in the middle of a project, my office looks exactly like I'm in the middle of a project. And if I'm kind of done with it, I clean it up and I'm like, it's an empty desk, which means I'm ready to do something new. So I could really relate to that. I think in general, the spaces that we work in are oftentimes overlooked in the effect that they have on our individual creativity. And I see exactly what you say. So I'm in a lot of organizations, and they try to build these like open and communicative offices where people like walk into one another, and then they talk to the people how they work. And I said, well, typically we work in small groups, and we would like to have more small offices where we can just nail something to the wall and bring ideas in. And so what's state of the art artistically isn't exactly state of the art for how the people would like to. I can really relate to this, like give them a garage, they can paint the way that they want as long as they feel confident within that. And I think oftentimes also when we work with people jointly, we kind of underestimate the effect that the room has on working together. So changing that around and seeing what options are oftentimes helps very much. For a time, there was kind of a play in psychology that they would change one variable, then do a creativity test and see how that variable on the room has an effect on creativity. And so the closer you get to nature, the better they were typically. So high ceilings are better than low ceilings, like blue or green, or like pale colors are better than like if it's very neon or red or something like that. But it's kind of what you probably also like in your. And one thing maybe to that room, so I was at a conference many years ago, and there was a guy presenting a study that they did, and they found out that windows have an effect on creativity. So if you have a room like that, it's probably bad. And they were rejected by several journals because they said, well, it's kind of obvious. Like, who would like to work in a room without a window? You have found out something that everybody knows in their gut. One study I found very interesting, so they changed the light in the room, very dim light or very bright light, and I think in that creativity test they had them draw aliens, and the ones in the very bright light, they drew aliens which were way more detailed but way more human, and the ones with the dim light, they painted aliens that are like furry creatures and had kind of like strange arms and legs, if at all. And I read that, and later I read Die Zeit, a big German newspaper, and they asked their columnists what they do when they need to be creative. And one of them answered, he turns off the light. So he sits at his desk and he dims the light, and that helps him come up with ideas. So given that time's up, I think it's something that we undervalue jointly, and that even just changing spaces, exploring, going somewhere might have an actual impact on our work. Time's up. You've been wonderful. You know everything. So that's very helpful. Thank you very much.